because Barkha has come an extremely long way from flying in from Delhi, but thanks to the complications of Pakistani airspace, a slightly elongated route to get to the United States. So, Barkha, welcome.
Thank you.
To Georgetown. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you.
So, as you know, this is our India Ideas Conference. It's our third effort at doing this, and the idea here is to create a conversation in Washington that's both similar to many of the conversations that already occur, but also to get perspectives really from the people who are out there on the front lines doing things. And of course, there are a few people more on the front lines than you, with all the media presence that you have. So I imagine this conversation will cover a lot of territory, but let me just start actually with asking you to reflect on the career in the media, what has changed over the years that you've been actively sort of on television, writing, etc. And what do you see just from a business perspective as sort of the big changes that are likely yet to come, right? We talk a lot about social media, we talk a lot about the digital threat to print media, etc. What are you seeing?
Thank you, Irfan. And hi, everyone. It's good to be here. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. Like most of you know, I'm a journalist, but you may not actually know in what context I actually started off in. I became a reporter in 1994. When I joined journalism, there was no private television in India. So I'm actually a child of television news. I was the first generation of television journalists in India. And when I started off, you only had the state broadcaster, which was Doordarshan, that would allow one 30-minute bulletin in English that was privately produced and one 30-minute bulletin in Hindi that was privately produced. And we had to send them the bulletin, the videotape. It was still the age of videotape, so we had to send them the videotape in advance, and then they would look through it, and then there would be occasional cuts and objections to content. So I started at that point to going through the years when television channels, literally exploded on the firmament of India. There were hundreds and hundreds of channels, and now we're firmly in the digital age. And I mark these three phases as three tyrannies, Irfan. I think we started with media being at the mercy of the tyranny of the state. We then went into a phase where the media was at the mercy of the tyranny of the market. So as many advertisers as came to you is how well you did. And finally, in the here and now, we're at the mercy of the tyranny of the algorithm. So for those who thought that the digital news space was going to set us free and make us a freer media, actually, that is absolutely not true. There is enormous pressure on online ventures to get what's called hits, and the more people read you, the more likely you're going to get onto the homepage or promoted by your digital sites. And so in everything, what really frightens me is that the revenue model continues to be so flawed, and people are so unwilling to pay for news. And they crib non-stop about the media they get, but they do not want to pay for a better media. And the fact is that reporters remain at the mercy of promoters, and promoters remain at the mercy of either the market or the government. And it creates a space where the media is raucous, we're argumentative, we're opinionated, but I don't think we're intrinsically free. If you were to ask me, is Indian media institutionally free? My answer would be no.
So that's extremely worrying for democracy in particular.
Yes,
A lot of people who observe Indian media talk about the reliance, in particular of the print, on government advertising as a primary revenue source. Do you think that's part of the problem, or do you think that this is actually deeper? It's not just print media, it's actually TV, etc., in terms of a reliance actually on the government, in terms of serving as the fourth estate that can check
I think that there is an over-dependence on government advertisement for revenue. I think that is absolutely true. It is truer for newspapers than it is for television, which is still able to draw some private advertising. Not that newspapers are not. But you will see newspapers going into complete panic when there are, for example, rate cuts, when the government cuts the rates. It also becomes a way for governments to be able to punish media that is not stepping in line. So, for example, you will see routinely when a big newspaper clashes, and I would include all governments in this. So, whether with the state government or the central government, the first thing or the easy thing for a government to do is to actually take back or cut the advertising, right? And so that's why I'm saying that we fail to understand see, there's this sort of, hand-wringing that goes on about the media being a business. I'm actually going to be contrarian and saying, I wish the media were run like a profitable business, because if the media were run as an efficient business, then this dependency on government, at least you'll still be dependent on the market, and there are other problems with that. But frankly, I'd rather be dependent on the market than be dependent on a government. So I think the problem is that we have not been able to create the news media into an efficiently run business space.
Let's get one other thing on the table. I feel underreported was just how violent a year last year was for reporters and journalists in India. Of course, there were some that made it to the national news, but so many more that didn't. And I think one of the things that is underappreciated about India is that India remains one of the countries in which being a journalist is among the riskiest places in the world to do that profession. You face it every day, right? I mean, you tagged me in a tweet this morning when you arrived at Union Station, and my mentions are a mess. So I can't imagine what that's like every day. But not to make light of, I don't want to talk about sort of the Twitter troll kind of thing, but just the safety of your colleagues out in the field, how you feel as both as a woman and as someone really much so visible. Can you just talk about that?
So, I would say I've learned to grow a thick skin about the kind of vitriol and abuse I get every day. And then I was just speaking at Women in the World, which is this conference curated by Tina Brown in New York. And I was on stage, and it occurred to me as I was saying this. I was saying to the women there, oh, you have to grow a thick skin. And then I paused and I said, actually, that is so wrong. It is so wrong that we tell ourselves that we have to grow a thick skin. It is so wrong that we tell ourselves that it's okay to get a rape threat or a death threat, to be called a whore or a prostitute, which is the sort of gendered abuse they use for you in India. It is so wrong that there's highly sexualized abuse that you actually absorb as normal life. It's almost like Twitter has become some version of boot camp, where you're being tested for how thick-skinned or how sort of numbed you can be for this kind of thing. And I just also want to make the point that actually we have to start seeing this online violence as very, very potentially spilling over into real life violence. And I will share a personal example with you. You're all aware of the terror attack that took place in Pulwama. And so here's what happens to journalists. One, you have ideological camps trying to own you. And I have resisted being owned by these ideological camps ever since I became a journalist. So I've reported on Kashmir for 2 decades and more of my life. So when this attack happened, I wrote a piece in the Washington Post saying everything is going to change. Everything is going to change, and that is what we're seeing happening. And my friends on the left thought that my response was too militaristic, too pro-state, too in favor of the military, and I actually had left-wing friends calling me a warmonger. And then Kashmiri students started getting picked on, and you actually had these mobs going after innocent Kashmiris who were living in other parts of the country, and just for no reason other than the fact that they were Kashmiri. So I went online and I said on Twitter that this is terrible, and this is actually playing into the adversary script, and there is a terror group that wants to divide Indian people, and that's exactly what we're doing. And within 24 hours of that tweet, I received 1,000 threatening WhatsApp and text messages and phone calls, including nude pictures, threats to shoot me, threats to rape me. And then I said, oh, I got really angry. Usually I'm a bit more blasé, I'm inured, I deal with this every day. So when these nude pictures started coming, I took the pictures and I put them on Twitter and said, I'm going to name and shame these perpetrators. And social media platforms, and I'm sure we'll get to that in a while, social media platforms are so tone deaf that they actually locked me out of Twitter and said I was the wrongdoer because I had violated the privacy of these men who were sending me these penis pictures. And I actually had to take police security. And I didn't want it, but the police, because as a journalist, I'm really uncomfortable with the idea of police outside my door. I can't function, I don't feel free, I don't feel independent, but the police was absolutely adamant. And this is the second time in the last 3 years that this has happened, that the police has had to provide me security, even if I don't want it, and I always push it away, and now it's gone again. But the point is that what we see is this kind of online chatter. This is the mob. This is the mob, and we have to recognize that in India there is an operational mob. It is politically organized, it is a well-oiled machine, and it comes after anybody who doesn't fit in or dares to question the dominant narrative. That said, I am still a woman of privilege. I am still a journalist of privilege. I know the police. The police will care about what I'm going to say on Twitter. My colleagues who operate in smaller towns, in non-metro towns, they do not know the police. They do not speak English. They are, often writing and reporting in regional languages. And they are the ones literally at the front line of reporting in India today. And, I think we pay ourselves too many easy compliments for being this, great raucous democracy. We are genuinely falling behind in institutional freedoms, and we really need to look carefully at how vulnerable reporters are just for doing their job. And these are reporters who don't even earn too much money. They're literally doing it for the passion of it. They're not doing it because it's a safe job or a safe space to occupy.
More to talk on that, but before we go down that path, we've talked about attacks in some sense by the trolls, we've talked about the threats from government. But last year was also this year in which journalism's dirty laundry was also aired, right? The attacks on women journalists in particular from those men who were supposed to be their mentors, were supposed to be their employers. In many ways, it felt like that Me Too moment in Indian journalism never quite reached the crescendo that I think a lot of us thought it was building to, that many of these men will persist, they'll re-enter after a little while in silence. Do you think this was, what do you make of it?
So I'm going to say something complex and possibly controversial here, so just give me a minute to make my argument. It is important to understand first why women in newsrooms do not speak against their perpetrators. It is really, really important to understand this. At least women of my generation, and I don't think it's easier for even women of this generation, we had to really prove that we were not soft. And it really mattered to us to prove that we were not soft. And it's intriguing how this takes place across generations. So my mother was India's first woman war correspondent. And in 1965, she covered the India-Pakistan conflict from the front line by lying to the Hindustan Times, who refused to send a woman to the front line. And she said, I'm going on vacation. And she took her notepad and pen. She had a cousin in the army, and she went to the front line to report this war. Yeah? And I grew up hearing the battles that women of my mother's generation had to fight. So I had some sense of what lay ahead. And in 1999, I found myself in the same argument, pleading with the army and pleading with my organizational superiors letting me go. So it was really important for women of my generation to prove that we were not soft, that we could take the blows that came our way, and we had to convince various people that we could go into spaces which were predominantly and numerically owned by men. Yes, so a war zone, covering politics, these are all spaces where numerically they're dominated by men. Now what happens is that if a woman is sexually harassed, as we have all been in the course of pursuing our work, the reason we remain silent is because we have had to fight so hard to just get the opportunity to do that assignment, that we start thinking that if we open our mouth about this, we're not going to get this assignment, we're going to be further ghettoized, we're going to be considered too soft, we're going to be considered too weak. So in this twisted sort of reality that we now occupy, I'm just trying to explain, it's very important to understand why women took years to speak about M.J. Akbar. It is extremely important to not judge the women who came out decades later to speak. Because I know that's the most common thing that's said. Why didn't you speak up when it happened? I know that women don't speak up when it happens, including myself, because we're fighting so hard to prove ourselves. We're fighting for the right to equal opportunity. And we don't have it. And we've almost made tolerating sexual harassment a test of how tough we are. And it's sad. It is really sad. And I really hope that this generation or the next generation does not have to sort of do this. And I think it also explains, I got into a bitter argument with some of my sort of senior colleagues, Tavleen Singh and others, who kept saying, what's the big deal? I was very angry, and then later I wanted to try and understand where this was coming from. And the only theory I can think of is that women who came before me probably had to fight so hard just to exist in the newsroom. Women of my generation had to fight so hard for the right of opportunity to that story. And I'm hoping that this generation, your age, is going in there saying, no, we don't have to take any of this, right? So you're right, we missed that, we have missed that moment that one MJ Akbar has not blown the lid off the number of editors, the number of male colleagues, the number of politicians, the number of interviewees who will sort of in an unwanted way invade your privacy, hit on you, say something scurrilous, say something suggestive. It's odious, but you have to empathize with why women remain silent.
No, never meant to criticize.
No.
I
wasn't taking it as criticism.
Right.
I'm saying it's just a complex thing to explain, right? It's a complicated thing to explain. But if you put yourself in a position of people who feel that they're constantly being tested, you have to understand that as women, we feel we're constantly being tested. And I'm seeing so many women like nod. I mean, I know women go through this. It doesn't matter what age.
Since you mentioned and acknowledged the privileged position you enjoy, I do think that the other thing that came out towards the end of last year was women in the vernacular press, Dalit women, sort of talking about the fact that their stories were not being promulgated on Twitter, etc. And so even as we tried to acknowledge it, we ignored or we didn't pay attention to so many other women.
So it goes back to the flawed revenue model of all news media, right? You will actually hear newsroom arguments where when the news list is being prepared, if you want to tell a story of something that's happening with a Dalit woman or let's say in the Northeast, or stories that remain on the margins, you will actually hear the argument that our audience is not interested in this. Our audience is not interested in this. This story isn't going to work. This story isn't going to get you the television rating points, so drop it. Or we can't spend money sending a reporter here because who's interested, right? And there's such a lack of reportage now in news that people don't even understand that the genesis of the Me Too movement was a village woman, a Dalit woman called Bhavri Devi. It was one of the first stories that I covered in the 90s. And I'll take a minute just to tell that story. So there was a woman who used to work with NGOs and the government to try and stop child marriages in a village in Rajasthan. Her name was Bhavri Devi. And she went to try and stop the marriage of a one-year-old child. One-year-old child. Among the rapists, she was gang raped, among the rapists was the father of that one-year-old child. She decided to fight this, and in the Rajasthan High Court, the judge said that this rape charge could not be true because so-called upper caste men would not touch. This was the understanding of rape, would not touch a Dalit woman. And she fought all the way to the Supreme Court, and it was on her case that the Supreme Court gave what Indians know as the Vishakha guidelines, which are workspace guidelines now mandatory on how to deal with sexual harassment complaints. Bhavri Devi has not got justice. It's been 22 years and more. And there is not going to be any television channel who's going to bring her on when they're talking about Me Too, which we have urbanized. We are telling those stories only through our socioeconomic spaces. Yeah? So it's an illustration of how the media mirrors a kind of larger elitism and the commerce of it, the flawed revenue models, the fact that there is no way to actually sustain news media. All of these are compromising us in different ways.
So you talked, and this is sort of the moment where I have to sort of do the what about, right? I mean, how much of what you're seeing, how much of what frightens you, to use your word, do you think has been a qualitative worsening, a deterioration of the situation since 2014? And how much of this is actually the weakly institutionalized protections for the press, the fact that lots of our governments of all parties have been, treated the press as sort of a nuisance, they don't respect it, and really we kind of live in a global moment where the President of the United States refers to the press as the enemy of the people, etc. So how much of this is the current government in India? How much of this is more general? How much of this is global?
So it's a bit of both. Let me first talk about the general truth. the general truth is that Donald Trump may abuse the New York Times, but will still be compelled to engage with it, right? That there will be pushback when Acosta of CNN loses his White House accreditation, that even Fox News will join the petition to actually make sure that he gets back in. And I just want to say that, people like to use this pejorative phrase, access journalism, that too many journalists are driven by the need for access to government. I find the use of this phrase as a pejorative very, very problematic, because journalists do need access to government to be able to tell what's happening in government. Yeah? And I think that the fight between Jim Acosta and the White House was so instructive for that reason, because it asserted that the right to be there is a fundamental right of freedom. So I think that the American media is way more institutionally free than we could ever imagine. Now, some of this is historic. There is Indira Gandhi and the emergency. There is Rajiv Gandhi trying to bring the defamation bill till there's a huge backlash against it. There were certainly n number of ministers in the UPA government, who tried to control stories and kill stories. So some of it is endemic. It is the way media is constructed. It is the fact that media is owned by business houses and that business houses are beholden to establishments of the day. So you can't single out Modi for this, but there are things that have changed after the Modi government has come to power. So I'm not, I actually rather think that it's become such a template that tomorrow if there's another government, I think all governments are going to do the same, because the media has capitulated so horrifically. And here's what's changed. Modi came onto national politics feeling like the media hated him because of his background as Gujarat chief minister and the way, at least the English language media. I mean, I can personally say that Narendra Modi hated 3 journalists. One was me, one is Rajdeep Sardesai, and one is Karan Thapar. He hated 3 journalists because at that time, we were the 3 prominent voices covering the Gujarat riots of 2002. And he also hated others in newspapers and who worked in newspapers and so on. And Modi came with this sort of paranoid complex that this media hates me, this media is biased, and his whole political communication was built on bypassing the mainstream media and communicating directly with people. So he used social media as a very, very powerful instrument to do this, and I think it worked for him. I think the othering of the media by Narendra Modi has actually worked masterfully for him. As if I were to just study it as political communication and not put myself there and say, oh, this is so terrible for journalism. If I had to just clinically study it, I think he's been a masterful political communicator in simply making the media irrelevant. In my opinion, the media is irrelevant today. It has been made irrelevant. And what's changed is Modi is the first one to just bypass the mainstream media, make gatekeeping, editorial gatekeeping absolutely irrelevant, communicate whatever you want to on social media, use WhatsApp, etc. as a vehicle for forwards and fake news, right? And what's happened is that the catch-up that other parties have played in this, nobody wants to engage with very few politicians are now ready to engage with the mainstream media. So the Modi model is now being adopted by other political parties as well. And so I would say that there is an endemic problem, and then there is a specific problem, and that specific problem is that Narendra Modi doesn't like journalists. And journalists, instead of returning this response with scrutiny or assertion, have mostly returned this with capitulation. So I think it's a mix of both.
I'm getting so depressed. So the irrelevance, on the one hand...
We've done this to ourselves.
Right, but on the other hand...
why blame Modi? I don't blame Modi. Modi is doing his job as a politician. The point is that the problem is we have to examine the roots of our democracy. There is a reason, are we an electoral democracy only? Or are we an institutional democracy? And my sense is that we are an electoral democracy and not an institutional democracy, because there is a reason that Stephen Colbert can get on late night television here and just say the sort of things about Trump that nobody could say about Modi or Rahul Gandhi or Priyanka Gandhi or Sonia Gandhi or anybody powerful in India. That extends, there is a hesitation to take on the powerful, and mostly if the reporters are ready, the promoters, the people who own those media spaces are not going to allow them to do it. And so we have to reflect that we have done this to ourselves.
So the promise of digital media, at least in part, was supposed to be that it freed us from that, right? So we have the birth of Scroll and Wire and any number of others, I don't mean to pick just those two, but any number of others, that in some ways it democratized access to it. I mean, I think of your Twitter following. I mean, you've got 6 or 7 million of them. Ram's got another 2, right? Others of them have several. I mean, that's a tremendous platform that is independent of a promoter. It's independent of something. I mean, but that doesn't seem to have balanced the loss of the other.
So, yes and no. I think the digital media is much freer. I think governments have not understood its capacity yet. But yet, I think you must understand that the kind of trolling and abuse that goes on, this is politically organized. So if you're thinking that, oh, there's just some random people who are like abusing Barkha because she said X today, or abusing Sagarika because she said Y tomorrow, or Swati Chaturvedi, whoever, I'm just picking up names who get trolled or abused on a daily basis. This is party politics at play. Please make no mistake, people are hired and paid to do this, right? I have never encountered offline the kind of reaction that this well-oiled machinery is able to conduct online. So it's not true that governments have not got to digital media. This, what we call trolling, this fake benign word for violent online abuse, is politically pushed. That's the first point. The second point, as I said earlier, is that we are at the mercy of the tyranny of the algorithm. I'm deeply disturbed in a way by the kind of enforced polarization that is being thrust on us, right? And I gave you this example earlier. This is something I've battled all my life, all my journalistic life, that I do not feel that I need to be ideologically true to one side all the time. I have maybe because I was in my 20s when I reported a war, I have a reasonable attachment to the Indian military. This is very problematic for my friends on the left. I'm constantly in raging arguments with them on this, yeah? But I am a aggressive social liberal, and I will stand up for innocent Kashmiris being picked on. But what digital media has done is that it has forced you into this either-or space. So, you've got to be a liberal of this variety, or you've got to be a right of center of this variety. What happens to libertarians? What happens to free thinkers? What happens to people who don't fit in? And wasn't expression and media supposed to be all about free thinking? And the other thing that's happened is, I have this phrase that the only way the media seems to be able to deal with the Modi phenomenon is either by being, I'll use a Hindi phrase, it's chamcha or morcha, which means you're either a supplicant or you're an activist. But the point is you have to be something, sometimes you have to be something in the middle. So you may hate, let's say you hate the BJP or you hate Rahul Gandhi. You still have to remove your own feelings from that to be able to tell that story in a dispassionate way. We've just lost that. And I don't think digital is freer relatively to television, and to television at least. Oddly, newspapers are still the freest. Oddly, it's very odd because they're the oldest space in these three mediums. I find newspapers the most, the greatest amalgamation or greatest diversity in one platform. I don't see that in television and I don't see that in digital. So even if you look at your digital properties, you largely know which way they lean. But if you read a newspaper, chances are that you will have a diversity of opinion. So that diversity of media under one platform, it's just dying. And also polarization is forced by this tyranny of algorithms. You want more hits, you're required to be more provocative. Your editor will spend all their time discussing what the headline should be. There's more time spent on the headline of a piece now than there is on the copy of it.
As a full-time India watcher, right, and of course as someone who grew up in India, I often think about the ways language changes and how we talk. So there are two in particular that seem to have crept into the way the discourse currently is that I would kind of wonder what your thoughts are. One is anti-national, right, as a generic term, but that's sort of an interesting, right? It sort of presumes a national, a nation state, right, and then there's the anti. But the other is this language of illegal immigrant, right, which really kind of crept into American discourse and seems to have made its way over to India in a big way. And maybe we can talk about anti-national, whatever, but I'm kind of curious about what you make of the fact that we've now adopted this language of illegal immigrant, right, that it is a religious identified group for the most part, right? Maybe it's even a geographic in terms of thinking of Bangladeshi, part of the Northeast strategy maybe of the BJP, whatever. But what should we think more generally about the fact that Indians are now talking about illegal immigrants?
So I think the most depressing thing is how normalized prejudice against the Indian Muslim has become. It is the singular most depressing thing about the last 5 years. And it is so normalized that we now see images of mob lynchings or mob attacks on Muslim cattle traders, on rumors. And by the way, every time it's a rumor. The cattle trader is never actually carrying beef or storing beef, but I find dwelling on that actually problematic because it's as if to suggest that if there was beef, then this would be okay. But the fact is that there is this brutalization that takes place. I mean, I've seen this in different ways in Kashmir. Like when there's something that happens repetitively, by the 10th time it happens, you're not as angry. You're not responding to it with the same fury, with the same disgust, right? So, to me, this acceptance of social prejudice and political marginalization of the Indian Muslim is revolting. And I think we should be so much more angry, and we are not. And this comment by the BJP president, which basically talks of how every immigrant is welcome into India as long as she or he is not a Muslim, or Maneka Gandhi reportedly saying to Muslim voters that if you don't vote for me, I will not do anything for you. Or the Prime Minister making a speech where he basically suggests that Rahul Gandhi is going to fight from the south because he wants to get away from Hindus. Rahul Gandhi may well be running scared because he thinks he's going to lose Amethi. So Rahul Gandhi is not the point of the story for me. But the point of the story is that the Prime Minister seems to suggest that going to a constituency that has the number of Muslim voters is a problem or is an embarrassment. So there is this normalization that is taking place. And I think the media makes a little bit of noise, but the media doesn't follow through. And the media then starts participating in this normalization. And more than anti-Muslim violence, you see it in this pseudo-nationalism or pseudo-patriotism. And it's hard to say whether television created this space or politics created this space and television simply mirrored it. But these sort of hashtag warriors or primetime patriots, as I call them, they have, to me, if anyone's anti-national, it's them. They have single-handedly damaged a tenuous situation in Kashmir. They have othered their fellow citizens. They have made enemies of regular people who, I may not agree with everything Kanhaiya Kumar, I never agree with Arundhati Roy. Let me give you an example. I almost never, personally, I don't relate to anything she says. But I really think it's kind of repulsive to pick up anyone you don't agree with and keep saying you're treacherous, you'll go to Pakistan. What is this? It's a reductionist sort of dialogue. And the media, there's this phrase, I mean, this might be sort of alien to some of you who are not familiar with the horrors of our television programs, but there's this phrase called the Tukre Tukre gang, right? And it basically means that these all these people who want to break India into little bits. Tukre is Hindi for little bits. And television channels use this phrase in their captions. Who will speak up against the Tukre Tukre gang? I mean, yeah, it sounds funny, but it is so alarmingly dangerous. It is so revolting, right? But I have a slightly different take here, apart from my general disgust. I think liberal media and political liberals have ceded this space to the right of center. I think the left in particular has spent too much time apologizing for sentimentalism about the Indian state. And I think that this sort of elite, armchair, academic take on India as a nation state has opened the space for the right wing to totally define it and own it. And if we are not able to understand that the average Indian citizen does feel a sentimentalism at being Indian, does feel goosebumps when, I mean, I feel them when I hear the national anthem play, does feel something about the men and women in uniform. if there's such sort of this kind of, I don't know, it's this odd kind of embarrassment about being a patriot, right? So if you're going to be embarrassed about being a patriot because you think it's not cool enough, then you are giving the space to these goons to define it for you. And I think we really need to get out of these echo chambers that we occupy, these small sort of cozy clubs where everybody thinks like us, and look at the world outside. And why is our communication failing? Why do people look at us and not connect with us? Now, you could argue that's not our job. But I personally think that we are communicators, and our job is to communicate without giving up our core values. I'm not saying we should compromise on our core values, but there is something flawed in our communication if we are not able to resonate. So this is probably the most depressing thing about, you asked me what is endemic and what is specific to the last 5 years. What is specific to the last 5 years is this business of labeling each other as anti-national. And this kind of religious nationalism, which is really a euphemism for anti-Muslim hatred. And we keep dressing it up. But then we have to ask ourselves, how did we get to this point?
On that very specific, I was thinking, several of the people you named, Rajdeep Sagarika, among others, have been on the stage in years past. And as I think about that landscape of elite journalists, or I'm struck by how few Muslim names are in there. So is there a problem of purely descriptive representation, if you would? Are these stories not being told? And why do you think that is? Why aren't there more primetime news shows being hosted by journalists of that faith? I mean, it is 20% of the population. You'd imagine that we could do better.
Because our newsrooms are not diverse. If you started breaking it down in terms of Dalit representation, even women, I mean, you now see women, but the fact is that women in positions of being editors or owners, very few, right? So this is sort of upper caste, upper class, male dominated, like politics is, like so many of our other spaces is. And I also think that the Indian Muslim journalist has to be defensive in a way that the rest of us don't. I mean, we're not defensive, but we're made to feel shame for simply doing our work, right? The number of times in a day, my name is instead of Barkha is called Burkha, right? And why is that, right? Because you're a Muslim lover, you're a Muslim, or are you even a Hindu? Repeatedly for my Kashmir reporting, it is said about me on the internet that I have 3 Muslim husbands. I'm not married, but this is how women are deconstructed for having an opinion. But the emphasis on 3 Muslim husbands, that explains your politics, right? So it is, we're not diverse enough as spaces, and I think that if I were an Indian Muslim journalist today, I would be really worried about, I mean, I'm trying to imagine this, that I'd be worried about not coming from a place where I'd be told, you have a siege mentality, or you're coming from a space of victimhood, and I would know that anything I express would get labeled, would get tagged, I would not be considered objective. And I just see a lot of Muslims going silent in these spaces. And I think we also have to spend some time not giving the Congress a clean pass on this. I think the fact is that the historic manipulation of the Indian Muslims started with the Congress party, whether it was the Shah Bano case, whether it was Rajiv Gandhi's decision to unlock the Babri Masjid, Ram Mandir disputed structure, whether it is the fact that the Congress can't seem to decide where it stands on an issue like triple talaq, whether it's the fact that the Congress is playing catch-up and offering a Hindu light to the BJP's Hindutva. So, or the fact that the Congress party very consciously refused to share the stage with Muslims in Gujarat in the assembly elections. So, I would go so far as to say that there is no genuinely liberal political party in India. I can't even think of one. I can't even actually think of a genuinely liberal Indian politician as an individual. Even on cow slaughter, what did Kamal Nath do? Kamal Nath wins the Madhya Pradesh election and imposes the National Security Act for cow slaughter. How does this make the Congress different from the BJP? It's like some toned down version. So then if you like that kind of politics, you're going, Arun Jaitley is right in saying, well, why won't you go for the original instead of the copycat version?
One question, and then we can open it up for a few minutes. But the fact what he just said makes me think about how optimistic we were about the Aam Aadmi Party and about Mr. Kejriwal, right? And how that optimism seems to have been let down, right? I mean, he was the hope for sort of a different liberal, maybe not liberal per se, but a different kind of politics, a clean politics, all of that. What do you make of the Delhi, I'll call it an experiment, right? 67 out of 70 seats in the state government, that big, incredible wave. What do you think?
But it's important to remember the origins of the Aam Aadmi Party and how the Aam Aadmi Party was born. The Aam Aadmi Party was born from an anti-corruption movement that was supported numerically by several right-of-centre groups, including the RSS, including Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, including Ramdev. I mean, we all have that memory of Ramdev getting into his salwar kameez and running away from the stage as the UPA idiotically sent the police after them. So it is important to remember that. And it is also important to remember that I'll come to Kejriwal later, but that was a dangerous time in the media because this easy judgment of people as corrupt and non-corrupt, I was always very uncomfortable with it. And look what happened. Mr. Kejriwal, used to take out these parchas of papers saying this politician is corrupt, this politician is corrupt. He got sued by every one of them. He's had to apologize to every one of them and take back his allegation, right? So I think that it was a very urban, it's the urban need for a non-corrupt politician. It's been sort of fashionable since the emergency years. And it was a very, very knee-jerk kind of, we're going to get the bad guys out of this, right? You cannot label people, you cannot be dishing out, just like you can't give out certificates of patriot and non-patriot, I don't believe that you can be giving out certificates of corrupt and non-corrupt. I think that is a job for the courts to do. You can certainly investigate it, you can put information in the public domain, and then you have to allow a process to take its job. But yes, in the larger picture, Arvind Kejriwal was the great hope, as you call it, because it was a party of self-made professional people. And I think Indians have longed for self-made professional people. In fact, if I were to analyze one of Modi's great advantages over the Congress party, it is that the Congress, when you see the Gandhis contesting, it represents a kind of entitlement. And you see a Narendra Modi and you say he came from nothing and he made himself. And I think Indians like the self-made, this boy who went to IIT Kharagpur, was a revenue service officer. It was a great middle-class dream. It was a great middle-class dream. But Arvind Kejriwal probably made the same kind of mistakes that all politicians do and is now paying the price for it. And now people have started saying, oh, we need a new political party. But this was our newest political party and, it's at the moment caught in a bit of an existential crisis and much will depend on what happens in Delhi.
We have some time. Let's wait for the mics and then I'll pick a couple. Yeah. So we can start here in the front. We'll keep the question brief, please.
Learning from all your experience and these things, what kind of next, after Kejriwal also we discussed, what is the next kind of better national evolution out of all this, whatever chaos and reality is better, truth is better, reality is chaos. So what is the positivistic aspect of national better evolution you are looking at, and what is the hope and how and what and how, why? How?
Before you answer that, Barka, we'll take at least a couple more. So one in the back corner over there with the scarf.
Yeah, thanks, Irfan. Hi, Baraka. So I come from an anti-national campus, JNU. So I teach social movements here at the George Washington. So thanks for raising this question. I mean, it's very interesting points you touched on, especially which I wanted to comment on the idea of the sexual assault, as you said, Me Too movement and all. And it's actually, this raised the whole debate again, and how the kind of untouched subject is always touched in a very violent way, and that's what the history of this. But when we look at the role of media in that context, I feel, the way media is also kind of perpetuating this tradition, not critically looking the caste as a cultural institution, and you see this whole massive entertainment industry which actually strengthens or or glorified the role of arranged marriages, and where you know, kind of, for middle class is fine, you know, but then for the lower class, where the Dalits and tribal people, where men gets all the rights to rape a woman, but how media glorifies it, that one point. Second is that how these days, because I'm also kind of, you know, part of the different Dalit movements, that how now, apart from Godi media and all, how now a new alternative media has been emerging. You have all these Dalit channels, Dalit Dastak, and all this. How do you see the role of these alternate Dalit media in kind of, you know, giving a counter position to the Godi media?
Maybe take those, and if we have time, we'll take some more.
So, I think what happens is that if you've been marginalized and underrepresented or not represented at all, your form of expression becomes perhaps more assertive or more militant in expression in a way that you may not have been if there was equality. So what I find is that a lot of this happens with a lot of local Kashmiri media. It happens with a lot of Dalit media groups. It's very difficult, and I don't say this at all with any disrespect because I understand, but it's very difficult to actually have a reasoned argument. Because if you say anything, you are immediately sort of typecast as elitist, Brahminical, you know, status quoist, etc. But we have to locate it within the larger thing of the absence of diversity and the absence of equality of these voices in our media spaces, and a kind of energized expression from these groups that have not been given this voice and space. And I'll give you a small example. We had Jack Dorsey, of the head of Twitter, come to India. And there were a group of us women who were taken to meet him, right? And one of the Dalit women came up and she gave him a poster in the end saying, smash Brahminical patriarchy, right? And I found Jack Dorsey absolutely tone deaf, absolutely ignorant. It was like this doped guy who would come from Silicon Valley who was just going through the motions of this meeting. It was a farcical meeting. But on our way out, I actually didn't see this poster because it was just like, you know, it's like you're stepping out of the door, somebody says, hey, can I just take a photograph? And she gave him this photograph. And I wrote a big piece about how I thought Jack Dorsey was an absolute idiot. But I would not have invested my cause with this sort of man who come from Silicon Valley to do some perfunctory conversation with me, knew nothing about my country, did not understand either caste or patriarchy or what is Brahminical. And so I ventured to say that, look, what was happening in terms of the noise around this was terrible, but really do we need Jack Dorsey to come and like validate us? And that was immediately misunderstood as some sort of, oh, you know, you're this upper caste elite woman. So there are these fault lines, right? There are these arguments that are going on, and it's a jostling for space and voice. And I think we have to understand that what we find, some of the rough edges are because of historic inequities.
Okay. So,
Your question, I don't have any motherhood and apple pie solutions for how to make India better. I think all I can say is that if more of us just did the job we were meant to, if more of us were professional in our individual spaces, if more of us were truer to our work, if more people were just true to their own work, I think it would be easier to have a better country. But unfortunately, too many people have compromised. People don't speak up. People don't say what they really think. People are too busy wanting to be popular. People are too busy seeking approval. And this all creates a space where democratic expression is curtailed. And without democratic expression, there can be no betterment of the country.
so
Vijay Nilekani. First of all, I want to commend you on your courage. And secondly, I agree with you that India doesn't have the constitutional safeguards that the US has in terms of freedom of expression and so on. But do you think the sheer diversity of the country, whether it's Kerala or Bengal with extreme leftism, or whether it's the regional parties, or what, the sheer diversity, and the fact that a disrupted, strife-filled society will struggle economically? I mean, that it'll scare away capital, it'll scare away investors, and so on. Do you think those two are reasonable safeguards? I know constitutional safeguards would be more comforting, but would you think those two safeguards would help India navigate through this mess?
I think the diversity, the cultural diversity for sure. The fact is that when you do travel to the southern states, you don't actually see the kind of fear almost that seems to have paralyzed or co-opted much of the north. But I don't share your optimism at this point. I really don't. And to me, to see what has happened with the Indian Muslim is such a depressing thing. And I keep thinking, I'm entirely irreligious. I actually don't identify with any religion. I'm agnostic. But again, I can afford to say that. It's the same way that I used to say in college, I don't believe in caste. I can afford to say that because I've never had to live at the other end of caste oppression. I can afford to say I'm irreligious because I've never had to live at the other end of, what this discrimination could feel like. And here we must also take a moment to comment on the self-appointed orthodoxies that claim to speak for the Indian Muslim. That the only stories you'll ever get told are of, the visual representation of the Indian Muslim is always the beard and the skull cap and the parda and the burqa, right? There are Indian Muslims who are just, if you were a Muslim in this room, I wouldn't be able to visually identify you. Why is our media not showing those stories? But I had for long thought that the diversity would create its own checks and balance. But power and the capture of power and how power manifests itself can essentially change countries. And I think we stand on that cusp today of wondering whether we are essentially going to change as a country or not.
My name is Madhavi. I study film and media and its relationship with society. And so you've kind of talked about the space where how digital media and traditional media differ on the spectrum of freedom and democracy. And so I'm curious to know what your thoughts are in regards to where the film industry fits on this spectrum.
So let's just say that it's absolutely different from the American film industry, which is extremely politically aware and extremely politically vocal. And I think you've seen a deep-rooted cowardice in how the film industry responds. But I will say, because some of them are people I've known well personally, I will say that sometimes I've done interviews with some of them and they've taken a position. And I'll give you an example. I remember interviewing Shah Rukh Khan when he turned 50. And he was giving an interview, one to me, one to Rajdeep. And it was just like this rambling, freewheeling conversation. And I think the Dadri lynching had just happened. And he said, I'm married to a Hindu. This religion thing is complete nonsense for me. We have the Gita and the Quran together. We have, all festivals celebrated in this house. And then he looked to the camera and he said, and don't you tell me to go to Pakistan because, I'm a proud Indian and my father was part of the freedom movement, etc., right? And I thought it was a superb interview. And what happens after that is he has a film release and you actually have all of these right-wing groups saying, we're going to burn down the hall, we're going to not allow this release, trolling, abusing. Now, yes, my feeling would be, Shah Rukh Khan, you're powerful and rich enough to take this on, right? And if the rest of us do, why can't you? But the argument you'll always hear, and at least my friends in the film industry always tell me this, that there are so many jobs, and a film crew is a big, giant thing. And they don't want to take positions that will jeopardize the lives and livelihood of other people. So, you have a Karan Johar who went in with folded hands, asked for, what had he said? He'd called Mumbai, Bombay, or I don't even remember what, and then he went and said sorry to Raj Thackeray, and then there had to be, Pakistanis. Shah Rukh Khan once said that Pakistanis should be allowed to play in the IPL, and for that, his film was not allowed to be released. So, while I wish that they would show more courage, there are economic consequences. Now, my theory is we all face those economic consequences. I can share with you that for a year and a half, I had media promoters telling me that we cannot give you a show on television because the word from the BJP is do not give her Barkha a show. So there are economic consequences to everybody, for everybody. These are the choices you make. And I wish that these very powerful, wealthy established voices of our film industry would. Because what's happening is that the voices who are speaking, it's this kind of self-caricature. There's a predictability to it. So you know that, okay, there'll be some 100 voices from the film industry signing some petition, but they're the usual voices. And the reason that our political conversation is not expanding beyond the established thing is that you can almost predict everybody's position. You know, you can predict this is what Barkha will say, this is what Ram Goa will say, this is what Arundhati Roy will say, this is what Nandita Das will say, and the rest won't say anything. Till the rest starts saying something, I mean, we're pretty impotent in making a difference. Because we've said this 1,000 times, nobody's listening to us.
The question is whether you can predict what Subramaniam Swami will ever say. So, Barkha, I mean, your willingness to engage this conversation so deeply, so thoroughly is really commendable, and we appreciate it very much. I want to ask maybe the most obvious one, right? I mean, we are, of course, in the midst of this election. The next panel is going to have a couple of our colleagues just really talking about the election and the implications of it from a US perspective, depending on the different scenarios that are likely. What do you think at this point, if you had to put a bet down, if I may ask, what do you think is going to happen?
I think Mr. Modi will be Prime Minister again. There are reasons for this. In the election travels that I have done so far, and I hesitate to take anecdotal conversations, but those are the only impressions one has. I don't sense the kind of embrace of Modi that I sensed in 2014, but I still sense a qualified support for him over others. And what you get to hear most often from people is that, well, at least, you see this man, he's not in it for himself, there's no family, there's no children to leave this to, he's just in this for, he's not getting anything out of it, right? He works so hard, he's a 24/7 politician. So many voters have said this to me. Then if you push them harder and you say to them, do you think it's right to use soldiers to court votes? Like, isn't that, by the way, anti-national, if you want to use that phrase? Do you think it's correct, this Hindu-Muslim politics? Almost everybody will say, no, it's not correct, right? But, he's done this. Demonetization was bad, but he's done ABC. There's no corruption there's no personal corruption that's stuck to Modi. The fact that he's seen as very hardworking. This kind of Spartan bachelorhood narrative, I think this is quite a powerful thing. It resonates with voters. And if we reflect deeply on it, some of our most successful politicians have actually been single people. So I was comparing this to the American system where you guys really have the need to see the family portrait. So the husband, wife, the children, the dog, the picket fence, perfection of suburbia, right? But in India, from you think Vajpayee, you think Indira Gandhi, you think Narendra Modi, you think of some of your most powerful women chief ministers, Jayalalitha, Mamta. There aren't these organized families around them that are known or accessible to people's imagination. And I think Indians see this absence of family as a kind of renunciation. I don't know for sure, but this is my impression, that this is something that works very positively for Modi in contrast to the Congress, which keeps coming across, and this is true for, I think, the emergence of populism everywhere, which keeps coming across as elite and entitled, and that's one part. And the second part is, I don't think the opposition has fought a very smart campaign. It's been very late, very slow. It hasn't understood that it doesn't have a persona to take on Modi. So it had only arithmetic. It's still been too slow to build its alliances. The Congress has an interesting idea in the minimum income scheme. But when I went to voters and I said, do you know what Nyay is? They said, we don't know. I think there was too much political capital spent on Rafale. A word that people can't even pronounce is not going to resonate at the grassroots. And I think that if the opposition had focused more on alliances and the economy earlier in this campaign, maybe there was some chance. So I think the analogy I would use is, it's kind of like, in 2014, people were in love with Modi. In 2019, it's the post-romance stage, right? So you're like, this guy, he doesn't clean his laundry, he's sometimes a jerk, he talks badly to me, but I don't want to be single. So I'll stay with him till I find someone better. I think it's kind of like that.
Nice,
can't really find a better way to end that. So. Great. The very next panel features, I'm going to ask Milan will be back up here talking about the election along with Rick Rossow from CSIS and Seema Siroi, a columnist for the Economic Times. So we have this wonderful continuation of a very prominent female journalist who's been doing incredible work from Washington to tell Indians about what's happening in the U.S.-India relationship, and in Rick Rossow, really someone who's transformed the conversation in Washington, D.C. about U.S.-India relations, and in particular an attention to the U.S., to the Indian states. So they'll be joining us in a minute, but please join me once again to thank Berka.